Dawn broke over the English countryside, but the sky was far from peaceful. A pale, cold light cut through low-hanging clouds as a line of B-17 bombers sat on the tarmac, their engines humming with restrained power. Inside the briefing tent, the air was thick with tension. Pilots hunched over maps, their faces pale under the harsh lamplight, while flight commanders pointed to cryptic symbols on aerial reconnaissance photos. No one spoke of the target by name. Not here, not yet. Only a select few in Washington knew what they were about to unleash. "Gentlemen," the commanding officer said, voice low but firm, "what you're about to do will never be spoken of in public. Some of our own may never know the full story. Keep your eyes open, trust your crew, and trust yourselves." His words lingered like a shadow over the room. Young men barely out of their teens swallowed hard, adjusting straps and checking instruments. The weight of the mission pressed on them, heavier than any bomb they would carry. Each pilot wondered silently whether they would make it home, or become another name lost in the fog of war. Radar operators whispered about flak batteries along the route, while intelligence officers reminded them that the Germans were ruthless and methodical. If this mission failed, history itself could be rewritten, and not in their favor. Outside, the first bomber roared to life, shaking with anticipation. A gust of wind scattered loose papers, carrying the faint scent of fuel and engine oil. The pilots climbed into the cockpits, helmets strapped tight, eyes scanning the horizon that promised nothing but uncertainty. Among them, Lieutenant James Harrington gripped the controls with a mix of fear and determination. His brother had been lost over France just months before, and now he faced a mission so secret that even the whispers of its existence were forbidden. Somewhere across the Channel, German counterintelligence had already begun to prepare. Agents were moving documents, rewriting reports, erasing any trace of what might come. If the Allies failed or even succeeded too well, no one would remember the truth. The world would remain blind to this moment. The bombers lined up, their shadows stretching across the tarmac. Engines thundered, the vibration rattling bones and nerves alike. Pilots exchanged brief nods, a silent pact of trust and resolve. The weight of history pressed down on them, yet each man was resolved to push forward. This was no ordinary mission. This was a gamble with fate itself. Then, without warning, the formation began to roll forward. The planes lifted off in unison, their wheels leaving the cold, damp ground as the sun climbed higher. Clouds swallowed them, grey and heavy, as the hum of engines filled the air. Below, the countryside receded, and the unknown stretched before them. Somewhere over enemy territory, the target waited, shrouded in secrecy and danger. Somewhere over Europe, the fate of thousands hung in the balance, and as the bombers vanished into the morning sky, the mission, one so terrifying that Germany would later try to erase it, was already underway. Every man on board carried with him the knowledge that by the time the day ended, nothing would ever be the same again. Weeks before the planes would roar into the skies, the mission existed only in whispers, buried deep in the bowels of Allied intelligence. In a dimly lit room in London, analysts huddled over a collection of grainy photographs, intercepted radio transmissions, and coded reports that seemed almost impossible to decipher. One thing became painfully clear: the Germans were working on something that could change the course of the war. A facility tucked deep in the heart of occupied Europe, heavily guarded, shrouded in secrecy, was producing a weapon the Allies could not ignore. Colonel Robert Thompson, a seasoned intelligence officer with sharp eyes and a quieter voice than most, traced his finger along the edges of a reconnaissance photograph. If this facility is operational, it won't just prolong the war, it could turn it in Germany's favor, he said, his words carrying an urgency that made the room tense. Around him, young analysts nodded, fear and determination etched into their faces. Every decision mattered. Every delay could cost thousands of lives. Top-secret reports painted a chilling picture. Satellite photography did not yet exist, so they relied on spy networks, aerial reconnaissance flights, and reports from operatives who risked capture or death every time they crossed enemy lines. The photographs revealed sprawling industrial complexes, lines of soldiers and trucks, and guarded compounds hidden among dense forests. Intercepted communication suggested that the Germans were experimenting with something unprecedented, a strike capable of devastating civilian populations if it fell into the wrong hands. The planners debated the mission endlessly. Some argued that a precision strike was possible, while others feared the consequences of failure. General Arthur Hargrove, a man whose face was as stern as his decisions, leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. We could destroy the facility, but what about the towns nearby? What about innocent civilians? The ramifications could be catastrophic, he said, tension threading his voice. The room was silent. These men were not strangers to the horrors of war, but the weight of this mission pressed down on them differently. It was no longer just about defeating the enemy. It was about doing so without losing their humanity in the process. Meanwhile, across enemy lines, German officers were growing restless. Major Heinrich Vogel, a calculating strategist stationed near the secret facility, had begun noticing irregularities. Allied reconnaissance planes had been sighted too close to critical locations, and intelligence reports were becoming more frequent, more precise. Vogel sensed something was coming. He paced the floor of his command office, maps and reports spread before him like a chaotic puzzle. "They are planning something," he muttered. "We must anticipate, intercept, and if necessary erase every trace before they can act." The tension between the planners on both sides created a deadly cat-and-mouse game. American officers moved with calculated secrecy, aware that a single slip could cost lives and compromise the mission. German officers tightened security, implemented decoy operations, and initiated counterintelligence measures that threatened to make the Allies' task nearly impossible. Every photograph analyzed, every code decrypted, and every decision weighed against not only military strategy, but moral consequence. The planning room itself was a battlefield of ideas. Pilots, engineers, and strategists debated flight paths, bomb loads, timing, and weather conditions. Lieutenant James Harrington, fresh from the flight school but already seasoned in nerve-wracking missions, studied maps late into the night. His hands shook slightly as he traced potential routes through dense German airspace, knowing that anti-aircraft guns, flak, and enemy fighters awaited. "We can make this work," he whispered to himself, though the doubt lingered in his eyes. Each route carried risk, and each risk could mean the difference between a successful mission and total annihilation. Reconnaissance flights provided the Allies with enough detail to make a decision, but never with certainty. Clouds, smoke, and camouflage structures obscured key targets. Each photograph had to be examined and cross-referenced with multiple intelligence sources. Reports came in from operatives embedded deep behind enemy lines, describing troop movements, the construction of underground bunkers, and experimental machinery. The Allies knew the mission was a gamble. Success would cripple the German war machine. Failure, or exposure, could erase the operation entirely from history, leaving those who risked everything in silence. Amid the calculations and debates, the human element remained ever present. The young pilots assigned to the mission would carry the full weight of history on their shoulders. Engineers meticulously reviewed the bombers, calculating trajectories and fuel loads, knowing that even the smallest miscalculation could be fatal. Intelligence officers considered contingencies for everything: mid-air refueling, navigational errors, and enemy interception. Every detail mattered. Every life mattered. By the end of the planning sessions, the mission had evolved into something almost mythic, a high-stakes gamble with the potential to end the war or vanish without acknowledgement. Allied intelligence had to be precise, coordinated, and ruthless in secrecy. Even the Allied command in Washington was kept partially in the dark to ensure that leaks were impossible. Only those who needed to know, pilots, key planners, and a few trusted commanders, were informed of the plan's full scope. Meanwhile, German officers worked tirelessly to anticipate every possible move. Vogel initiated clandestine sweeps of the surrounding areas, ordered the removal of civilians from sensitive zones, and instructed his staff to maintain the illusion that the facility was ordinary and unimportant. In doing so, he unwittingly escalated the tension. Every precaution taken by the Germans made the Allies' task more dangerous, but also more urgent. The longer the mission was delayed, the higher the stakes became. As night fell over England, the planners in London gathered one last time. Maps spread across the table, photographs pinned to boards and radios crackling with faint static. Colonel Thompson addressed the room. "Tomorrow we take the first step in changing history. Remember this, no one may ever know what you are doing. Success will save lives, failure may never be recorded. But whatever happens, you must move forward. The world depends on it." The young pilots left the room with silent determination, their faces illuminated by the flickering lamp. Outside, the air was thick with fog, the chill biting through heavy coats and gloves. Engines waited on the tarmac, ready to carry men into the unknown. The mission was no longer just an operation. It had become a burden of conscience, a test of courage, and a gamble with fate itself. Somewhere across enemy lines, Major Vogel was already preparing to counter their every move, unaware that the Allies had pieced together just enough to challenge even his most cunning defenses. The room emptied, leaving only the maps and the ghostly echo of planning. Outside, the wind carried the faint hum of the approaching dawn. Soon, men would climb into bombers and fly into history. The stakes were higher than any of them could fully comprehend. A German weapon that could prolong the war, a mission so secret it might vanish from record, and the lives of countless young men hanging in the balance. Tomorrow, the unthinkable would begin. The sky above the English Channel was a muted grey, the kind of cold that seeped into bones and nerves alike. Inside the bombers, the pilots' faces were tense, illuminated by the soft glow of instrument panels. Lieutenant James Harrington gripped the controls, knuckles white, his first combat mission stretching out before him like a living nightmare. He could hear the low hum of the engines, the constant vibration of the heavy plane, and the occasional clatter of loose tools bouncing against the metal frame. "Steady, steady," he whispered more to himself than anyone else. Around him, his crew moved with mechanical precision, each man silently aware that their lives depended on both skill and luck. The navigator, Corporal Robert Lane, studied the map spread across his knee. His thoughts drifted for a moment. His wife, waiting in a small town outside London, and the child he had yet to meet. He shook his head, forcing himself back to the mission. Every second counted. Every mile carried them deeper into the jaws of enemy territory. The first warning came in the form of distant flak bursts, black puffs against the clouds far below. Harrington squinted, the bursts seeming to grow larger with each passing second. The sky was not empty, it was alive with danger. Anti-aircraft fire rained from below, the deafening thuds making the bombers shudder violently. A mechanic cursed under his breath as an engine sputtered, flames licking the exhaust for a brief, terrifying moment before stabilizing. Hearts raced and adrenaline surged through every vein. The German defenses were methodical, relentless. Radar detection stations had already picked up the formation hours earlier, alerting flak batteries and fighter squadrons. Harrington's radio crackled intermittently, brief, coded messages from other bombers in the formation. "Keep tight. Stay on course. Don't break formation," the voice urged, calm on the surface but tense beneath. Each man understood the stakes. Stray too far, and the enemy could pick them off one by one. In the rear of the plane, Sergeant Lewis, the tail gunner, scanned the skies with a practiced eye. "Bogey at 11 o'clock, he shouted suddenly. A Messerschmitt fighter sliced through the clouds, its machine guns rattling, making the bomber shake under the strain. Harrington adjusted course, banking the plane slightly, while the gunners returned fire, tracer rounds cutting arcs of orange and red through the sky. The young pilot's heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. Amid the chaos, camaraderie became their lifeline. Corporal Lane called out headings. Sergeant Lewis covered the tail, and the bombardier double-checked his instruments. Moments of quiet reassurance passed between them. A nod, a brief joke, a hand gripping another's shoulder. These gestures were small, but in the midst of death and fire, they were a tether to humanity. Then came the mechanical failure that nearly ended them. One of the engines began sputtering again, smoke curling from the exhaust like a dark warning. Harrington's stomach dropped. "We can't lose an engine now," he shouted over the roar, adjusting the throttle, praying the others would hold. The crew worked in unison, emergency drills executed with a speed born of necessity. Sweat and fear mingled on their brows as the plane lurched, barely maintaining altitude. The cold metal frame shivered with every burst of flak. The ground below, a dangerous blur of forests, rivers, and farmland. As the formation pressed further into enemy territory, the Germans intensified their attacks. Radar operators on the ground tracked every movement, sending waves of fighter planes to intercept. Anti-aircraft batteries opened in rapid succession, explosions ripping the air with terrifying force. The sky became a battlefield of light and shadow, tracer rounds arcing like deadly ribbons. Harrington's hands shook, but he forced himself to focus. Knowing the lives of his crew and the success of the mission depended on his calm under pressure. Amid the tension, the human stories behind the uniform shone through. The bombardier, Private First Class Samuel King, thought of his younger brother serving in France. He clenched his jaw, whispering a silent prayer that they all make it through. Sergeant Lewis, scanning for fighters in the tail, pictured his mother worried sick, waiting for news that might never come. Each man carried a fragment of home, a reason to survive, a reason to fight despite the overwhelming odds. Then came the moment that would define the flight. A formation of German fighters dove from above, engines roaring, guns blazing. The bombers twisted and turned, tracer rounds illuminating the sky like fireflies caught in a storm. Harrington banked hard, narrowly avoiding a collision, while flak bursts shook the plane violently. Smoke filled the cabin from an engine hit, the acrid scent stinging their eyes and throats. For a brief, terrifying instant, it seemed as though the mission would end in flames, their names lost to history before the story had even begun, but sheer determination carried them through. The crew worked as one, executing maneuvers learned in months of grueling training. The enemy fighters, frustrated by their coordination, began to pull back, allowing the formation to regain altitude. Harrington exhaled a shaky breath, his hands trembling, yet his resolve hardened. They were still alive, and still on course. As the first hints of the target appeared below, a cluster of industrial buildings camouflaged among dense trees, the tension reached a peak. Anti-aircraft fire continued to rain from below, each explosion sending shivers through the fuselage. The crew tightened straps, gripped controls, and whispered prayers in unison. Every second mattered. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and the mission and their lives would be over. Through it all, the pilots and crew discovered an unexpected truth. In the heart of fear, their humanity shone brightest. The young men who had once been civilians, brothers, sons, now carried not only bombs, but courage, determination, and an unwavering sense of duty. Each glance, each gesture, each whispered reassurance became their armor against the chaos of war. And as the bombers pressed onward, slicing through the gray morning sky, the enormity of the mission crystallized. They were flying into the very heart of danger, into a zone the Germans had fortified with deadly precision. Yet despite the fear, despite the mechanical failures, despite the relentless barrage of anti-aircraft fire, they pressed on. The mission was no longer a plan on a map. It was reality, a test of skill, bravery, and luck that would determine the fate of thousands. Somewhere below, Major Vogel and his officers watched through binoculars, unaware that the Allies had navigated the gauntlet with a combination of training, courage, and calculated risk. The bombers approached the target, each second stretching into eternity. And every man on board understood the truth. History would be made or forgotten in the next moments. The forest and factories below loomed larger, dark shadows against the muted earth. Smoke from anti-aircraft bursts spiraled into the sky, the rumble echoing in the ears of every crew member. Harrington's heart pounded with a mix of terror and resolve. The moment of reckoning, the approach to the target, was imminent. One wrong maneuver, one missed calculation, and everything they had risked would vanish into the clouds, and in that fragile, terrifying silence that descended for a fleeting instant, the crew braced themselves, knowing that the next minutes would define their courage, their mission, and the story that for decades the world might never hear. The bombers had reached the target. Below, the German facility sprawled across the forest floor, camouflaged with netting and hidden among the shadows of trees. From above, it seemed almost serene, a precise, almost innocuous cluster of buildings, smokestacks, and transport vehicles. But the quiet was a cruel illusion. Every pilot and crew member knew that beneath the surface, a weapon capable of prolonging the war was waiting, and their mission would decide whether it survived. "Release point in 30 seconds, Harrington called over the radio, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. The bombardier, Private First Class Samuel King, adjusted his sights, fingers gripping the controls with white-knuckled intensity. Each man in the plane held his breath, aware that the next moments would define everything, success or failure, survival or death. Below, anti-aircraft guns fired with relentless precision, the black puffs of flak blooming like deadly flowers across the landscape. Harrington banked slightly, dodging explosions, while the other bombers in the formation followed, maintaining perfect spacing to avoid collision. Tracer rounds cut fiery arcs across the sky, illuminating the bomber in streaks of orange and red, a dangerous ballet of metal, fire, and chance. King focused through the bombsight, sweat stinging his eyes. He adjusted the trajectory, calculating wind, altitude, and the speed of the plane. The weight of the ordnance pressed down physically and mentally, tons of explosives poised to rain destruction. "Steady, steady," he murmured, as if repeating the mantra could ensure precision. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, with a controlled motion, King released the bombs. Silence overtook the cabin for a heartbeat, the calm before the storm. Below, the payload descended, hitting the facility with a precision honed by months of planning and reconnaissance. The explosions erupted in a series of violent, synchronized blasts, ripping through roofs, walls, and vehicles. Fires erupted immediately, devouring the factory like a living, hungry thing. The pilots and crew watched from above, faces a mix of awe and horror. Trees splintered, concrete crumbled, and clouds of smoke billowed toward the heavens. The ground shook violently, as if the earth itself had screamed in pain. Harrington's stomach churned. The victory he had hoped for was intertwined with destruction and loss. He glanced at Lane, who refused to look away from the chaos, jaw tight with emotion. On the ground, German officers scrambled to respond. Major Heinrich Vogel barked orders, frantic and disbelieving. Communications lines crackled with tension. "All units contain the damage. Evacuate civilians where possible. Destroy any evidence. Destroy all evidence," he shouted, realizing that the attack had struck deeper than anticipated. Secret files, experimental equipment, and carefully constructed bunkers were reduced to rubble. The Germans began the painstaking work of erasing what they could. But the scale of the destruction was undeniable. Smoke and fire obscured the landscape, and reports came in of vehicles and personnel obliterated by the explosions. German soldiers ran in confusion, some firing at the sky in desperation, others attempting to save what little they could. Propaganda teams began hurriedly altering records, erasing the mission from reports and planting false narratives. For a brief moment, the world was blind to the truth, as if the chaos itself had swallowed evidence whole. Inside the bombers, the emotional weight of the mission settled over the crew like a shroud. Harrington's hands shook as he guided the plane away from the target, trying to suppress the guilt gnawing at him. Was the destruction justified? Were the lives lost truly necessary for the greater good? Each man carried his own version of the answer, some muttering prayers, others gripping straps so tightly that their knuckles turned white. The exhilaration of success mixed with the heaviness of consequence, creating a tension almost too thick to breathe. But the danger was far from over. Anti-aircraft fire intensified as the Germans scrambled to retaliate. Harrington adjusted course, dodging bursts that exploded nearby, shaking the bomber with violent force. Fighter planes dove from clouds above, guns blazing. The tail gunner, Sergeant Lewis, fired relentlessly, the deafening staccato of machine guns filling the cabin. The bomber wobbled under the strain, engine stress indicators flickering, smoke curling from minor damage sustained during the attack. Every man felt the razor-thin line between life and death, yet despite the chaos, there was a grim satisfaction. The facility had been destroyed. The weapon, whatever it was capable of, would never see completion. The Allies had struck a decisive blow, but victory came at a cost that each man would carry for the rest of their lives. Harrington's eyes burned from smoke and adrenaline as he stole one last glance at the inferno below. He saw structures flattened, vehicles overturned, and fires consuming everything the Germans had worked so hard to hide. And he wondered, would history remember this day, or would it vanish like smoke into secrecy? Below, German officers continued to issue orders in frantic whispers. Vogel realized that even if he could destroy the remnants, witnesses would live to tell fragments of the story. He began compiling reports, directing soldiers to fabricate narratives that downplayed the attack. The mission, he knew, would become a ghost in official records, a terrifying event that only the few who survived would carry in memory. Harrington pushed the bomber higher, feeling the strain of combat pressing down on him. Engines roared under stress, instruments flickered, and every jolt reminded them that the enemy had not yet surrendered. Around him, the crew moved in synchronized urgency, checking gauges, adjusting flaps, and keeping their collective focus razor-sharp. They had achieved their objective, but the war was far from over. Every second in enemy territory brought new threats, and then, slowly, the formation began to pull away, climbing higher into the sky. Smoke and fire faded behind them, leaving a scarred landscape that would bear witness to destruction for years. The bombs had done their job. The Germans would attempt to erase the evidence, but the mission's impact was irreversible. For the young men in the sky, relief mingled with exhaustion and grief. They had struck a blow that might shorten the war, yet the cost, so vivid, so immediate, would haunt them forever. As the bombers disappeared into the clouds, the world below seemed to pause, holding its breath. Somewhere in the distance, more flak burst into the air, but the Americans had survived. The facility was gone. The mission, though perilous and terrifying, had succeeded. Yet each man knew the truth. Victory was not a simple thing. It came wrapped in smoke, fire, and the echoes of destruction. The planes pressed onward, engines droning, the sun breaking through the clouds, illuminating a sky that had seen death, courage, and history itself unfold. And as they flew further from the target, every member of the crew understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary, something the world might never fully know. They had unleashed a firestorm, changed the course of the war, and survived to carry the story. A story that Germany would later try to erase, but one that could never truly be forgotten by those who had lived it. The sky had cleared over the devastated facility, leaving smoke and ruin as the only testament to the airstrike. But on the ground, the German response was swift and calculated. Major Heinrich Vogel moved like a man possessed, orchestrating a desperate effort to erase any trace of the attack. Soldiers tore through offices, shredding documents, burning files, and smashing typewriters. Photographs of the facility, blueprints of experimental machinery, and coded reports were consumed by fire, smoke curling toward the sky as if to claim the truth itself. Vogel barked orders to his officers, his voice taut with panic. Every trace must vanish. Intercept communications, secure witnesses, and make it appear as if nothing happened. The officers scrambled, understanding the stakes. The Allies had struck a severe blow, and yet the world could never know. It was as if history itself had been challenged, and the Germans were determined to win this battle of memory. Propaganda teams began to move quickly. Newspapers and radio broadcasts in occupied territories declared that the attack had failed, that the Allies had missed their targets, and that any damage was minor and insignificant. Civilians were told that German defenses had held strong, creating a veneer of normalcy amidst devastation. Officers whispered in corridors about the phantom bombing, hoping to convince themselves as much as the public that the mission had been a failure. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence struggled to piece together the aftermath. Reports came in from reconnaissance flights after the strike, but anomalies were obvious. Some photographs were smudged or missing, and key documents intercepted from the Germans were incomplete or destroyed. Analysts in London and Washington pored over every scrap of information, growing increasingly frustrated. Colonel Robert Thompson slammed his fist on the table, muttering, "They're trying to erase it. They're hiding the proof. But we know it happened. We just need to connect the dots before it's gone forever." Every piece of evidence seemed to vanish the moment it was uncovered. Reconnaissance photos revealed the damage, but German camouflage and scorched earth tactics obscured critical details. Intercepted messages hinted at cover-ups but rarely confirmed specifics. The Allies realized the mission's success was only half the battle. The other half was ensuring that the world would ever know the truth. In a war built on deception, this operation had become an invisible victory. The human element of secrecy weighed heavily on both sides. German officers intimidated witnesses, factory workers, guards, and civilians who had seen the bombers in the sky or felt the ground shake. Threats were whispered, coerced confessions demanded, and rumors spread to confuse those who might tell the story. Every eye and ear that might bear witness was scrutinized, every voice silenced or redirected. It was a meticulous campaign, one designed to make the world forget before it could remember. Vogel himself grew increasingly obsessive. Each day, he combed through reports, inspected destroyed facilities, and ensured that propaganda lines were consistent. "No one must know the full extent," he insisted to his aides, pacing the length of his office. "We cannot allow history to record this, not a single detail. If the Allies believe we have hidden nothing, they will underestimate us, and our reputation must remain intact." For the Allied planners, the secrecy was maddening. Thompson and his team reviewed debriefings from pilots, navigators, and reconnaissance officers, all of whom had seen the facility reduced to rubble. Yet when they tried to confirm the scale of destruction, records were incomplete. Reports contradicted each other. Some areas appeared untouched, others obliterated. The Germans' erasure campaign had introduced uncertainty, forcing Allied intelligence to rely on indirect evidence and oral accounts from surviving operatives. This struggle extended beyond logistics and strategy. It became a moral and historical dilemma. How could they prove a mission had succeeded if the evidence was systematically destroyed? How could they honor the bravery of the young pilots who risked everything when the world might never know their deeds? It was a tension that gnawed at every officer, every analyst, and every crew member who had survived the airstrike. The truth existed, but capturing it, preserving it, and communicating it would require patience, persistence, and a kind of stubborn courage different from that of the battlefield. The German cover-up also had unexpected consequences. Within their own ranks, officers began to doubt the official narrative. Soldiers who had seen the facility in flames whispered among themselves, questioning orders and wondering what really had happened. Fear of reprisal kept them silent, yet the story survived in fragments, snippets of memory, half-remembered conversations, and private journals. It was in these small, fragile threads that the seeds of truth persisted, waiting for someone to piece them together decades later, even as the Allies struggled with incomplete intelligence. They understood one undeniable fact: the mission had achieved its immediate goal. The facility was destroyed, the experimental weapon project halted, and the Germans had been forced into a defensive panic. But the broader historical significance, the story of the strike itself, remained uncertain. It was an invisible victory, a ghostly triumph in the annals of history. Every report smudged, every photograph burned, and every witness intimidated was a reminder that truth could be as fragile as paper or as fleeting as smoke. In the quiet of the night, back in London, Thompson and his team reviewed every piece of data they had. Photographs, radio intercepts, flight logs, and pilot testimonies filled the room, a mosaic of destruction and courage. "They're trying to bury it," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. "But we won't let them. History will remember, even if they try to erase it." There was resolve in his voice, tempered by exhaustion. The mission's secrecy had created an invisible battlefield, one waged not with bombs or bullets, but with memory and information. And so the tension lingered. The pilots, now safe thousands of miles from the target, knew they had succeeded in the skies, yet wondered if their courage would ever be acknowledged. The Germans, in frantic denial, erased, rewrote, and spun the narrative, determined to bury the truth. Allied intelligence chased shadows, piecing together fragments while the clock ticked toward obscurity. The story hung in the balance, fragile, perilous, and suspended between memory and erasure. Somewhere, hidden in a secret archive or the mind of a surviving pilot, the evidence waited, waiting for the day the truth would finally emerge. The cover-up was formidable, but courage, memory, and persistence have a way of defying even the most meticulous attempts at concealment. And as the smoke cleared, both literally and metaphorically, one fact remained indisputable. The airstrike had happened. The Germans had tried to erase it, and history itself would one day demand the story be told. The war had moved on, leaving the skies quieter. The bombs ceased and the smoke long faded. But for those who had flown the mission, survived it, or witnessed it from the ground, the memory lingered, not as a clear photograph in the mind, but as an emotional scar that refused to heal. For decades, the story of the airstrike, the one Germany had tried to erase, remained buried beneath layers of secrecy, classified reports, and deliberate omissions. And yet, among the few who had lived it, the memories were as vivid as the day they had taken flight. Lieutenant James Harrington had returned to London after the war, a decorated hero in the eyes of those who knew the facts. But in the shadows, he carried a burden that accolades could never erase. On quiet evenings, he would sit by the window of his modest flat, staring at the darkened skyline, remembering the roar of engines, the streaks of tracer fire cutting across the sky, and the inferno below that had destroyed the German facility. The mission had been a success, yes, but success had its price. He remembered the faces of the crew, the tension in the cockpit, and the way the bombs had fallen with such precise devastation. That clarity, that unfiltered reality was something no medal could honor. Harrington's memoirs, written decades later, reveal the duality of war. Heroism intertwined with guilt. "We did what we had to do," he wrote in careful, deliberate handwriting. And yet, watching those fires rage, I could not help but wonder how many lives had ended in an instant, how many innocents had been caught in the shadow of our mission. History might call it a triumph, but we lived with the consequences in ways no one could see. For the navigator, Corporal Robert Lane, the emotional toll was equally profound. Lane had survived the mission, guided the formation through anti-aircraft fire, and ensured bombs struck their target, yet his mind remained haunted. Nights were filled with fragmented dreams, the forest below erupting in flame, the black smoke rising like a living entity, and the faint cries of civilians, imagined or real, that he could not place. Lane had never spoken publicly about the mission, partly because the details were classified, and partly because he could not bear to reconcile the horror with the precision they had executed. "I sometimes wake in the night," Lane confessed decades later to a historian researching the strike, "and I see it all again. Every man in that bomber, every explosion, the way the earth seemed to open beneath us. I do not regret the mission, but I cannot forget it either. It changed me. Even the youngest members of the crew carried stories of quiet courage, the kind that rarely makes it into history books. Sergeant Lewis, the tail gunner, had been the first to spot incoming fighters and return fire. The fuselage shuddered under enemy rounds, and yet he had maintained focus, protecting those behind him with skill and instinct. After the war, Lewis spoke little of the mission. In letters to his family, he referred to it vaguely, never fully explaining the chaos of fire and flak, the weight of life and death decisions made in seconds. Sometimes bravery isn't celebrated, he wrote. Sometimes it's a burden you carry alone, but the stories were not limited to the airmen. On the ground in occupied Europe, civilians and members of the resistance had witnessed the aftermath firsthand. In a small village near the target facility, villagers had felt the tremor of explosions before smoke obscured the sky. Some had seen the bombers at dawn, their engines a distant roar, and had scrambled for cover as buildings shook and fires consumed structures. Among them was a young resistance fighter, Matthias Weber, who had watched from the forest. He recalled seeing the German soldiers rushing to cover documents and destroy evidence, their panic apparent even through the smoke. None of us spoke, Weber remembered. We were too afraid. And yet, in the silence, we understood the magnitude of what had happened. The Allies had struck a blow we had only dreamed of, and yet it was invisible to the world. We knew, and that knowledge was ours alone. The weight of secrecy was not just a German tactic, it was a shield, a way to control the narrative, and for decades it worked. Allied intelligence records confirmed the operation, but the mission was classified at the highest levels. Historians seeking confirmation found incomplete reports, missing files, and conflicting accounts. The young pilots and their crews became ghostly figures in history books, heroes whose deeds were acknowledged in whispers, never celebrated openly. Survivors struggled with the duality of pride and pain. Harrington, Lane, Lewis, and others had risked their lives, executed a mission that altered the trajectory of the war, and yet were forbidden to share their experiences publicly. Some turned to private journals, diaries, or letters, their words hidden away in attics, filing cabinets, or personal archives. Others spoke only to close family or trusted historians. Knowing that the truth of the airstrike could not be revealed until decades later, even decades after the war, the secrecy and silence imposed a peculiar kind of heroism. Men who had flown through fire and flak, who had released bombs over a secret German facility, were celebrated quietly among comrades, but unknown to the world at large. And for many, the inability to share their experiences compounded the trauma. We lived with ghosts, Lane told a researcher in the 1980s. Not the ghosts of the dead that I could understand, but the ghosts of truth. The story existed, yet we were forbidden to tell it. Resistance fighters and civilians who had witnessed the mission added layers of complexity. Weber, now an old man, reflected on the moral questions the mission posed. He understood its strategic necessity, yet he had also seen the immediate cost: destroyed buildings, terrified soldiers, and civilians caught in the periphery. For him, the strike was a reminder that war's consequences are rarely clean or simple. The line between heroism and horror is often invisible until decades later, when history can finally reconcile deeds with outcomes. The secrecy extended even to the families of the airmen. Harrington's wife, for example, never knew the full details until decades after the war, when documents were declassified and historians began to ask questions. Letters he had written home during the war were carefully vague, describing missions as routine or testing flights, never hinting at the scale of destruction he had witnessed firsthand. Lane similarly concealed details, protecting not only himself, but those who had served beside him. Their silence became a form of loyalty to their comrades, to the mission, and to history itself. Yet even in secrecy, the stories found ways to survive. Interviews with surviving crew members decades later reveal the weight of their memories, the camaraderie that kept them alive, the terror that tested every nerve, and the knowledge that they had changed history in ways the public would never know. They spoke of the moments between explosions and flak bursts, of jokes shared to relieve tension, and of the quiet, unspoken bonds that develop in the crucible of combat. These human stories, once hidden, provide a window into the emotional truth of war, beyond strategy, beyond victory, and beyond propaganda. The historians who eventually pieced together the airstrike describe it as a ghost mission, one whose strategic importance was immense, yet whose details were almost entirely erased from records. Archives contained fragments, pilot logs, partial reconnaissance photos, intercepted communications. The larger narrative was obscured by intentional German cover-ups and Allied secrecy, leaving a gap in history that only survivors' testimonies could fill. These accounts, full of emotion, fear, and courage, form a mosaic of truth that for decades remained largely unseen. Even today, the legacy of the mission lingers. The airstrike altered the course of the war, halting a German project that could have prolonged the conflict and cost countless lives. Yet for the young men who flew into the storm, the memory is inseparable from guilt and trauma. Harrington, Lane, and Lewis, each in their own way, acknowledged the paradox. They had achieved something extraordinary. But the cost, visible only to those who survived, remains indelible. And still, the story waits. Decades later, as historians uncover declassified files, photographs, and personal diaries, the mission finally emerges from the shadows. The planes, the crew, the explosions, and the desperate acts of the Germans to erase evidence all converge into a narrative that the world can finally grasp. But even with proof, the emotional truth, the terror, the bravery, the guilt, and the camaraderie cannot be fully captured. It exists in memory, in testimony, and in the quiet reflections of those who survived to tell the story. As Harrington once wrote in his journal, "History may record our mission, but it cannot record the faces, the fear, or the silence we carried afterward. That is ours alone." Lane echoed the sentiment in interviews decades later, saying, "We did our duty, we carried the mission, we survived." And yet the truth of what we saw, what we felt, remains a secret even now. For those who cannot understand what it means to be alive in that moment, the suspense of the untold story, hidden by both enemies and allies, reminds us that heroism is often invisible, courage is often silent, and truth is sometimes buried beneath the weight of history. The airstrike, executed with precision and bravery, remains largely unknown to the public, yet its consequences shaped the war, altered strategies, and ensured that lives would be spared. And somewhere, in the memories of surviving airmen, resistance fighters, and civilians, the story waits. Suspended between history and revelation, a testament to courage, secrecy, and the human cost of war. In quiet moments, the surviving crew would still close their eyes and see the inferno below, hear the roar of engines, and feel the tremor of the earth as bombs fell. It was a memory that could never be erased, despite the Germans' best efforts, despite decades of secrecy, and despite the world's ignorance. It lived in them, in their shared experiences, in their letters, and in the rare interviews that captured fragments of a mission that history had tried to forget. And as the decades passed, the question lingered, would the full story ever be known? Would the bravery, the fear, and the human truth finally emerge from the shadows of secrecy? For the survivors, that answer remains unresolved, a suspense that mirrors the tension they faced in the skies. A reminder that even the most meticulously erased events leave traces, waiting for the moment when the world can finally understand the magnitude of what happened. Decades had passed since the roar of engines and the firestorms over the German facility. For years, the airstrike existed only in the memories of those who had flown the mission, those who had witnessed it on the ground, and in fragments of classified reports hidden deep within Allied archives. The Germans had tried meticulously to erase every trace. Files burned, photographs destroyed, witnesses intimidated, and propaganda broadcast to obscure the truth. Yet, as often happens in history, truth cannot be fully buried. In the early 1990s, historians began uncovering documents long thought lost, reconnaissance photos tucked away in forgotten vaults, pilot logs previously classified, and coded communications from German officers that survived only because of archival oversight. The images were stark. The facility reduced to rubble, charred remains of buildings, and scorched earth stretching across the forest floor. Reports from surviving pilots confirmed the photograph's authenticity, describing in detail the moments when bombs had struck, fires had erupted, and anti-aircraft defenses had rained their fury upon the formation. Dr. Margaret Klein, a historian specializing in Allied operations, described the discovery as one of the most extraordinary revelations in the study of World War II air campaigns. She explained that the airstrike had been strategically decisive, halting a German project that could have prolonged the war and caused countless additional deaths. "What we are seeing now," she said, "is confirmation of the bravery and precision of the aircrews. The scale of destruction and the risk undertaken was immense, yet for decades, this mission was almost invisible to history because of deliberate erasure. The newly revealed documents also shed light on the Germans' frantic attempts to rewrite the narrative. Intercepted orders, now translated and declassified, show Major Vogel directing officers to destroy files, intimidate civilians, and disseminate false accounts of the bombing's failure. They tried to erase it, to make it vanish from memory and record, Dr. Klein noted. But paper burns. People forget less easily than records do. And the truth, decades later, emerges. For the surviving airmen, the revelations were bittersweet. Lieutenant James Harrington, now an elderly man, reflected on the decades of secrecy, the weight of memory, and the slow, painstaking recognition of their actions. "It was terrifying," he said in an interview, voice tinged with both pride and lingering guilt. "We did something extraordinary, yes, but we also saw destruction no one should witness. To have the mission finally acknowledged, it is a relief, but it cannot erase what we carried home in our minds." Corporal Robert Lane, the navigator, echoed the sentiment. He spoke of the emotional complexity that had followed him for decades. "We flew into the jaws of death and came back alive. That in itself was a miracle, but the images of what we left behind, the fires, the ruined facility, the chaos, remained with us. Recognition is one thing, but the scars of memory are permanent. Historians now emphasize the moral duality of the mission. It was terrifying and destructive, yet strategically vital. The young men who risked their lives had shortened the war, potentially saving countless lives, yet they bore the heavy burden of guilt and trauma. This moral complexity is a central theme in the story of the airstrike. Heroism and horror intertwined, each amplifying the other. Images of the ruins, combined with oral histories and declassified reports, provide a haunting testament to the event. Forests that had once hidden the facility now stand silent, scarred only by memory. The skies above are empty, yet those who flew the mission remember every detail: the hum of engines, the bursts of flak, the fiery arcs of bombs descending with deadly precision. These memories, paired with newly uncovered documents, allow historians and the public to grasp the magnitude of what occurred, even if the full emotional weight can only be understood by those who lived it. The legacy of the airstrike, now emerging from decades of secrecy, is both sobering and inspiring. It confirms the courage of the young pilots, the precision of Allied intelligence, and the impact of a mission that was, for decades, almost entirely unknown. Yet it also reminds us that history is fragile, that truth can be buried, and that recognition often comes long after the deeds themselves, in the quiet reflection of those who survived, and in the stillness over the site of the ruins. One is left with a haunting image: the charred remains of buildings once vital to the war effort, standing as a ghostly reminder of destruction and courage. The empty skies above, silent witnesses to past firestorms, and the reflective gaze of veterans, remembering not only what was done, but what was endured. The airstrike, terrifying and decisive, had been nearly erased from history. Yet through the resilience of memory, declassified documents, and painstaking research, it has finally been revealed. The bravery of those who flew into the unknown, the strategic foresight of Allied planners, and the unyielding truth that refuses to remain hidden ensure that the mission will not be forgotten. And so, as the sun sets over the quiet forests where fires once raged, the story of the airstrike lives on, not just in the records and photographs, but in the hearts and memories of those who survived, and in the enduring pursuit of historical truth.